What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
At Friday night dinner, my dad laughed and said, "Maybe one day you'll make us as proud as your brother." I smiled, helped load the dishwasher, and left. The next afternoon, my brother texted, "What did you say to Dad? He hasn't come out of his room." And just like that, the balance of power in our family cracked open, not with a bang, but with a sentence so measured, so calmly delivered, it sliced through the air like a scalpel. But before we get to what I said, before I let you guess how I finally got under the skin of a man who'd barely acknowledged my existence for the better part of my adult life, you have to understand something. No one becomes a villain in one night. They earn it, layer by layer, dinner by dinner, joke by joke, silence by silence. Every Friday night for as long as I could remember, we gathered at my parents' house for the same tired ritual dressed up as tradition. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, steamed green beans, and the slow, surgical dismantling of my self-worth, all served up with a side of forced civility. It wasn't some explosive, dramatic kind of dysfunction. No one threw wine glasses. No one screamed or cursed. No, this was the colder kind of cruelty, the slow drip, the kind that looks like politeness to anyone watching from the outside, but feels like dying by paper cuts from the inside. I'm Erin, 38. No kids. Never married. Dropped out of med school 16 years ago, which, according to the subtle tone shifts at our family dinners, was the moment I silently forfeited my shot at being anything close to worthy in my father's eyes. I work as a vet tech, not glamorous, not headline making, but I'm damn good at it. I spend my days helping creatures that can't speak for themselves, which, now that I think about it, is probably the most honest metaphor for my family role that I could have stumbled into. And then there's Daniel, my older brother by 2 years, orthopedic surgeon, husband to Jessica, father of 2 shiny, overachieving kids who call me Auntie E with a practiced cuteness that makes my teeth itch. Daniel is, and always has been, the crown jewel of the family. He's the one with framed degrees on the wall, the one who makes the local news when he volunteers on a medical mission, the one Frank, our dad, introduces to strangers like he personally engineered him in a lab. It's not that I hate Daniel. I don't. He's fine. He plays his part. He laughs when Dad tells his military stories for the 100th time. He smiles and nods when Mom brings out her worn photo albums. He knows what to say and when to say it. And more importantly, he knows when to shut up and not rock the boat. I, on the other hand, have always been the boat rocker. Not in big ways. Not with drugs or arrests or public disasters. No, my rebellion has always been quieter, not showing up to the Christmas Eve party, staying silent when asked about my love life, never bringing a +1 because I got tired of watching men squirm under my father's evaluation gaze. It's not that I wanted applause. I just didn't want to have to explain my life like it was some incomplete resume. So Friday night rolled around like it always did. Same driveway. Same porch light that flickered and never got fixed. I brought a bottle of cheap wine out of habit, even though no one ever drank it. Jessica brought homemade focaccia that she somehow made look like it came out of a cookbook photo shoot. The kids ran around the table in circles until Frank barked enough in that gravelly tone that still made me flinch, even now. We sat down, plates were passed, pleasantries exchanged. The kind of night that looks warm and loving in a photo, but feels sterile and transactional in real time. Then came the moment. The one that always came. Dad turned to Daniel and said, "Heard your clinic got mentioned in that health magazine. That's a hell of a thing, son. You know, when I talk to the guys at the Legion, they all know your name now. You're really making a name for yourself." Daniel did his usual modest smile and head tilt. Jessica gave a little, "he's too humble," chuckle. I stared at my fork and quietly chewed my overcooked chicken. I knew what was coming next. I always knew. Frank turned to me, not with malice, not even with sarcasm. Just that flat tone he always used when my presence required acknowledging. And then he said it, just like he said it before in some version or another. "Maybe one day you'll make us as proud as your brother." And something in me, something so old and buried it barely had a voice, stirred. But I didn't snap. I didn't throw my fork across the table or raise my voice or cry. I smiled, gently pushed back from the table, and began collecting dishes. As I reached for Daniel's plate, he tried to make eye contact, maybe expecting a joke or a deflection. But I didn't give him anything. I loaded the dishwasher like I always did, methodically, quietly, like someone fulfilling their unpaid family obligation with grace and resignation. I told them I was tired. Long week. Heading home early. Marcia, my mother, offered a drive safe, sweetheart, as she handed me a Tupperware container of leftover beans I didn't want. Dad didn't even look up. Just asked Daniel about some new article he'd read in The Atlantic. I left through the kitchen door and didn't look back. I didn't cry in the car. Didn't even feel angry. But there was something sharp sitting behind my ribs, like a blade I'd finally remembered I was carrying. And the next afternoon, when Daniel's message came through, "What did you say to Dad? He hasn't come out of his room." I didn't respond. Not right away. Because the truth is, I hadn't even said the thing yet. Not really. But I was going to. And when I did, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be cruel. It would be honest. And that, in our family, would be the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. It's strange how memory works, how certain moments play back like a flawless recording, down to the scrape of a chair leg or the flicker of someone's eye, while other, more significant years collapse into vague impressions and fuzzy snapshots that don't quite add up to anything solid. That particular Friday night, the one where everything shifted, remains crystal clear in my mind, like it was frozen in amber, untouchable and unchanged, as though some part of me knew, even then, that this wasn't just another forgettable family dinner we'd all quietly resent and then repress. This was the last time I would ever walk into that house pretending I didn't see the cracks in the foundation, the rot beneath the paint, the performance we all participated in like unwilling extras in a bad sitcom no one had the guts to cancel. I remember the smell of garlic and rosemary, the thick scent of roasted meat clinging to the air like a curtain of obligation, and I remember the sound of my mother humming tunelessly in the kitchen. The way she always did when she was trying to keep herself from speaking, her passive act of self-erasure, one I used to mistake for grace until I got old enough to realize it was just another form of cowardice. Jessica was already there when I arrived, placing sprigs of something decorative on the side of the serving platter, because even food, in her world, had to be curated like an Instagram spread. Daniel was in the living room with Frank, both of them leaning forward in that synchronized posture men use when they're discussing something serious. Stocks or sports or medicine or whatever topic allowed them to remain emotionally disengaged while still maintaining the illusion of connection. And I, as usual, was background noise. Present but peripheral. Like a coffee table or an old lamp. Not someone to be asked about her week, or her work, or her life. Just a fixture that appeared when scheduled and disappeared when dismissed. Dinner began like it always did, with prayer, not because we were religious, really, but because Frank liked structure, liked the idea of tradition, liked the sound of his own voice when he could deliver it with solemnity. We all bowed our heads while he muttered something vaguely spiritual, and then plates were passed, glasses were filled, and the game began, the subtle game of conversational warfare where no one raised their voice, but everyone came armed. It started innocuously, as it always did, with small talk about Daniel's work. He'd performed some complex surgery earlier in the week, on an elderly patient with brittle bones, and Frank listened with rapt attention, nodding and grunting in approval, tossing out military metaphors as though Daniel had stormed a beach rather than fixed a hip. There were compliments about how calm he stayed under pressure, how precise his hands were, how proud any father would be to have a son like that. Jessica beamed, gently touching Daniel's arm, with the kind of practiced affection that looked authentic enough to pass. Then, without any ceremony or malice, like he was commenting on the weather, Frank turned to me, fork in hand, and delivered his usual refrain, the one that came in so many versions over the years it had lost all surprise, but none of its sting. "Maybe one day you'll make us as proud as your brother." No chuckle this time. Just a flat statement. A comparison. A reminder. And something in me, something patient and exhausted and absolutely done, snapped, not in the loud, cinematic way we always imagine breakdowns to happen, but in a soft, deliberate shift, like the final movement of a lock clicking open. I didn't respond right away. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled, kept chewing, and let the silence stretch longer than anyone was comfortable with. I watched as the moment passed, unnoticed by some, but not by Daniel, whose eyes flicked toward me, searching for a reaction he wouldn't find. Marcia looked down at her plate, pretending to be absorbed in her green beans. Jessica reached for her wine glass with a little too much interest, as though she'd just remembered it existed. I didn't speak until the plates were mostly cleared and the kids had been ushered into the den with iPads and vague instructions to keep it down. I offered to help with the dishes, not out of duty, but because I needed the cover of movement, the comfort of water running and plates clinking, the illusion that everything was still under control. My mother stood beside me at the sink, passing me bowls to rinse, neither of us speaking, both of us pretending this was normal, that this was love. I could hear Frank and Daniel laughing in the other room, their voices overlapping in that way men's voices do when they're trying to out-masculine each other without realizing it. Something about football or someone getting arrested, whatever the topic was, it didn't matter. What mattered was the ease with which they connected, the unearned familiarity, the assumption that this bond was natural and fixed. When the last dish was loaded and the faucet turned off, I dried my hands slowly, turned to my mother, and said, quietly, "I'm going to go." She nodded, like she already knew, and handed me a container of leftovers without looking me in the eye. No hug. No goodnight. Just the choreography we'd all memorized long ago. As I passed through the dining room, Frank barely looked up, just gave a distracted drive safe, like I was the mailman or a neighbor kid he barely recognized. And I, for the first time in years, didn't say you too. But just before I reached the door, I stopped. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies. I simply turned, walked back toward the dining table, placed the Tupperware on the nearest chair, and waited until Frank looked up from his magazine or paper or whatever the hell he had in his hand. And when he did, when his eyes met mine with that mild expression of obligation, I said the sentence. Just one. Nothing rehearsed, nothing loud. And yet, I won't tell you what I said, not yet, because it wasn't the sentence itself that changed everything. It was the fact that I said anything at all. That I broke the ritual. That I made the air shift in that living room, forced everyone to notice the space I occupied and the voice I had so carefully trained myself not to use. It was the silence that followed, the long, frozen second where no one moved or breathed or swallowed. That second held more weight than all the years I had spent trying to be palatable, quiet, safe. Then, without waiting for anyone to react, I picked up my keys, walked out, and drove home through empty streets that suddenly felt wider, clearer, somehow easier to breathe in. The next day, Daniel's message came in at exactly 1:36 p.m. His tone was clipped, confused, a little panicked. "What did you say to Dad? He hasn't come out of his room." And for the first time in a very long time, I let the question sit unanswered. Because finally, they were the ones sitting in silence. Finally, they were the ones left wondering. People always expect explosions when something breaks. They wait for shouting, for glass shattering against the floor, for someone to storm out with a slamming door and a string of curses trailing behind them like smoke. They expect tears, fists on tables, loud confessions that leave everyone winded. But that's not how real fractures happen, not the ones that matter. The most devastating breaks come silently, like hairline cracks in glass that spread without warning, invisible until the entire pain gives out under the pressure of something small, a breeze, a look, a few carefully chosen words. What I said to my father wasn't poetic, it wasn't even rehearsed. It was short, it was simple, and it was so goddamn honest that it lodged somewhere deep inside him and refused to let go. But before we go back to that sentence, to the exact moment it left my mouth and changed the temperature in the room, we need to go further back, because a sentence like that doesn't rise out of nowhere. It builds itself over time, brick by brick, memory by memory, insult by omission. And mine began forming decades ago, in 100 different moments that I can still feel in my body, even if the specifics have blurred around the edges. I remember being 11 years old, sitting on the living room floor with a biology textbook open on my lap, trying to sound out the Latin names of bone structures while Daniel showed off his first science trophy to our dad. I remember the way Frank's voice swelled with pride, how he laughed and clapped Daniel on the back and told him he had the mind of a man who gets things done. I remember looking up, waiting for even the smallest comment on my efforts, not praise, just acknowledgement, and watching him walk away mid-sentence as if I hadn't said a word. I remember birthdays where Daniel got toolkits and telescope sets and I got bathrobes or cookbooks, gifts that felt less like presents and more like nudges toward a role I never agreed to play. I remember the way Frank would introduce Daniel to his friends at the Legion bar, saying, "This is my son, the surgeon," with that gruff pride in his voice that always stopped just short of a smile. And when I was standing right there, he'd simply say, "This is Aaron," like that was supposed to be enough. No title, no context, just a name, floating there like a footnote. I remember the day I left medical school, not because I couldn't handle the science, but because I couldn't handle waking up every morning feeling like I was suffocating under a weight no one else seemed to notice. My panic attacks had become so constant I could barely sleep without waking up drenched in sweat, chest locked, mind racing, and when I told Frank I was withdrawing, he looked at me like I'd announced I was moving to a cult in the desert. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how I felt. He just said, "So what are you going to do now, work at PetSmart?" and walked out of the room. I carried that with me, carried all of it, tucked it deep where no one could see, especially not him. And the irony, the part that still makes me shake my head in disbelief, is that for years I still tried. I still showed up. I still answered his calls. I still came to Friday dinners and laughed at his worn-out stories and listened to his casual, thoughtless remarks like they were harmless. Because some part of me still wanted the thing I'd never had: his attention, his pride, his approval. Until I realized that what I wanted didn't even exist. Not really. He didn't know how to give it. Maybe he never had it to begin with. So when I stood in that dining room doorway, leftovers in my hand, hearing him make that same tired comment about Daniel, "Maybe one day you'll make us as proud as your brother," I didn't plan to respond. But I turned. And he looked at me barely, just enough to register that I was still there. And then I said it. "You should be proud of him, Dad. After all, he's everything you wanted me to be, back when I still gave a damn about making you proud." That was it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't say it with venom. I said it like I was telling someone the time. Simple. Matter of fact. Truthful. And in the stillness that followed, in the way his hand paused halfway to his water glass, in the way Daniel stopped chewing and stared, I saw it land. I saw it sink in. Frank didn't say a word. He didn't scoff or deflect or change the subject like he usually did. He just sat there, completely still, staring at me like I'd just spoken in a language he hadn't heard since the war. I turned and left. Got in my car. Drove home. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. Like I'd finally put down a bag I didn't realize I'd been carrying since I was a teenager. And the next day, when Daniel texted, "What did you say to Dad?" He hasn't come out of his room. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel joy. I felt something deeper, something quieter. I felt real. Seen. Even if just by myself. Because that sentence, that one line, was never about revenge. It wasn't about hurting him. It was about reclaiming something. About finally drawing a line in the sand and saying, "You don't get to write the whole story anymore." And the thing is, I knew that it wasn't just about Frank. It never was. That sentence, and everything behind it, had started to change things for all of us, for Daniel, for Marcia, maybe even for Jessica and those kids who still had time to learn what real connection looked like. Because once you break the silence in a family like ours, once you speak the unspeakable, there's no going back to pretending. There's no more safe ground. Everything shifts. Every unspoken truth begins to echo louder in the space you've cleared. And even though I had no idea what would come next, I knew this. It would not be quiet. Not anymore. When Daniel showed up at my apartment the next morning, I wasn't surprised by the knock on the door, nor by the fact that he'd driven across town without warning, still dressed in whatever he'd slept in: sweatpants, a zip-up hoodie, And that haunted look of someone who had spent the night thinking about a conversation that hadn't even involved them directly, but had managed to rearrange the furniture inside their head anyway. He stood there with his jaw set, eyes sharp but uneasy, the same way he looked back in high school when he got caught cheating off a lab partner, not ashamed exactly, but confused as to how things had gotten out of hand so quickly. As if the rules had changed while he wasn't paying attention. I stepped aside and let him in, not because I owed him anything, but because I could tell he wasn't here to fight, not yet at least. And I didn't want a scene unfolding in the hallway of my apartment building where my neighbors would hear just enough to twist into gossip. And misinterpretation. He walked inside, didn't sit, just stood in the middle of the living room like someone trying to assess the damage after a storm, and then he finally spoke, his voice low and tight, almost cautious, as though the wrong word might set off another detonation. "I don't know what the hell you said to him," he began, pausing like he expected me to jump in, to defend myself or at least interrupt, but I stayed silent, letting him fumble through the discomfort like he was the one carrying the burden now. But he's not talking. He won't leave his room. He skipped breakfast, which you know is a whole thing with him. He didn't even take his morning walk. Mom's freaking out. There was a time when hearing those words would have triggered a wave of guilt so immediate and overwhelming that I'd have done anything to undo the damage, called, apologized, begged to be misunderstood, but that time had passed, and now I just nodded slightly, walked over to the window, and looked out at the parking lot below, where a dog was barking at a squirrel like it had just discovered a new species. I waited for Daniel to say more, to fill in the silence with his usual logic, his well-practiced empathy, the role he always played so well, the voice of reason, the adult in the room. The one who could talk everyone down from the ledge without ever actually addressing the edge itself. But instead, he sighed, rubbed his face, and finally asked the question he'd come for, the one that had clearly been gnawing at him since yesterday. "What did you say, Aaron? What the hell did you say to him?" I turned back to face him then, studied his expression, the mix of genuine concern and underlying annoyance, and I realized something that made my stomach turn, not from anger, but from a kind of resigned sorrow. He wasn't really asking what I said. He was asking how I could be so inconsiderate, so reckless, so selfish as to disturb the fragile ecosystem that kept our family functioning, even if that ecosystem was built entirely on delusion, denial, and decades of strategic silence. So I told him the truth, not just the sentence, which he already knew now in some shape or form, but the truth behind it, the real reason I said it, the thing none of them had ever cared enough to ask. I said what I needed to say. I began, my voice steady but stripped of the usual diplomacy I'd once used to navigate conversations like this. I told him the truth. Not some dramatic version of it, not an attack, just the plain, unfiltered truth about how it felt to spend an entire life in the shadow of a son he decided was worthy before I even had the chance to be anything. I said what I said because I'm done pretending like it didn't matter, like it didn't shape every single thing about who I am, about how I see myself. I said it because he needed to hear it, even if it broke him. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second I saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, not even confusion, but recognition, the kind that settles like dust on an old photograph, a slow, reluctant acceptance of something you can't unsee once it's in focus. He sat down, finally, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and let out a breath that sounded like it had been stuck in his lungs for years. "I didn't know," he said quietly, almost too quietly. "I mean, I guess I did, on some level. I just never thought it was that bad." And there it was, the sentence that wrapped up every apology he didn't know how to say, and every moment he'd looked away instead of stepping in. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit there between us, like a bitter offering, like something that had taken too long to arrive and had already started to spoil. Because it wasn't just that he didn't know. It was that he didn't want to know. None of them did. It was easier to believe that I was just difficult, just sensitive, just not trying hard enough to connect. "You didn't want to know," I said finally, not accusingly, but plainly. "You didn't ask. You never asked me how I felt after I left med school. You never called just to talk. You never noticed when I started skipping holidays, or when I stopped sharing anything personal. Because it was easier to let me disappear than to admit that maybe the family story you'd all been telling yourselves wasn't true. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the floor, like he was counting the scratches in the hardwood as if they might somehow give him a way out. After a long silence, he said, "He's not going to apologize, you know. Even if he comes out of that room. He's not built that way." "I know," I replied. "I'm not waiting for one." He stood up then, stretched like he'd been sitting too long in a position that hurt, and glanced toward the door. "I'll tell Mom you're okay," he said, which made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfectly useless sentence, the kind of thing people say when they don't know what else to offer. I walked him to the door, and just before he left, he turned to me and said something that I've replayed more times than I care to admit. "I think you broke something in him," he said. "And I don't know if that's good or bad." I didn't answer. I just closed the door behind him and stood there for a while, letting the silence settle back around me. Because the truth is, I didn't know either. Maybe I broke something. Or maybe I just cracked open the thing he'd spent his whole life locking down. Maybe it wasn't damage. Maybe it was daylight. But I also knew this, the part that no one wanted to say out loud. Sometimes, what breaks a man isn't the cruelty of others, but the moment he finally sees himself clearly for the first time. And maybe that's what happened in that quiet house, in that shut door, in that man who suddenly couldn't face his own reflection. Because what you don't say, in families like mine, is the most dangerous thing of all. The phone call came 3 weeks later, just after midnight, at that hour where the silence feels heavier than usual and every sound carries twice the meaning, as though the world, while resting, is somehow more honest in the dark. I was lying in bed, not asleep but hovering in that strange in-between state where your body has given up but your mind refuses to follow, when the screen lit up with "Mom." I stared at it for a moment, already knowing she wouldn't call at that time unless something had either fallen apart or begun to heal. There were no middle-of-the-night updates in our family unless someone was bleeding or dead, or, more rarely, something truly unexpected had happened. I picked up, not rushing, not panicked, but with that familiar feeling in my chest, the tight, brittle tension I always got when I heard her voice, as though I were bracing for her to speak on someone else's behalf. To act again as the go-between in a family that never quite knew how to speak directly to one another without turning their sentences into daggers or shields. She didn't say hello. She never did when it was bad. She just sighed in that long, breathy way she had when she was stalling, and then said, "He's seeing someone. A therapist." It's only been a couple of sessions, but he went. I didn't say anything. I just lay there, holding the phone to my ear, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer some response I couldn't find inside myself. My mother waited, gave me space, something she rarely did when I was growing up, and then added, "He hasn't talked about it, not directly. But I know it's because of what you said. That night, after you left." And then, more softly, in a tone so hesitant it made my throat tighten, she said, "He's quieter now. Not angry. Just thinking." For a long time, I had imagined that if my father ever truly saw me, not just looked in my direction, but actually saw who I was, what I carried, what I endured, the moment would be loud, like glass breaking or doors slamming. A confrontation or confession that tore the fabric of our family clean in half. I imagined it would come with shouting, with the kind of raw, cinematic breakdowns we see in shows that try to mimic real life, but never quite get it right. But the truth, as always, was less dramatic and somehow far more unsettling. Because he hadn't come bursting out of his room to rage or apologize or fight. He had simply gone silent. And now, according to the woman who had spent 40 years learning to read him like a locked journal, he was sitting with that silence instead of running from it. That was the part that scared me the most, not that he was hurt, not even that he had started to question himself, but that maybe, just maybe, he had started to question the story of who he was as a father, a husband, a man. And if he was doing that, if he was finally turning that hard, critical gaze inward, then everything that had once kept our family intact through its patterns and rituals and lies was no longer fixed. It was dissolving. And when those old narratives disappear, so do the roles we've spent our lives trying to perfect. After we hung up, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry either. I just lay in bed and stared at the faint outline of my bookshelf, at the plants by the window that probably needed watering, and thought about all the things I'd said and all the things I hadn't. Because even though I had finally spoken my piece, had finally uncoiled the truth I'd carried like a splinter buried too deep to remove, there were still pieces of it I hadn't shared, fragments I wasn't sure anyone would ever understand. I hadn't told anyone that after every Friday dinner, I would drive around my neighborhood for an extra 20 minutes just to avoid walking into the stillness of my own apartment, afraid that the echoes of my father's voice would fill the silence if I didn't drown them out first. I hadn't told Daniel that I used to Google how to stop caring if your family doesn't love you the way you need late at night, scrolling past listicles and self-help nonsense that couldn't begin to grasp the uniquely soul-numbing ache of being invisible to the people whose eyes you once begged to meet yours. I hadn't told my mother that I resented her more than I admitted, not because she was cruel, but because she was complicit in her passivity, always smoothing over the rough edges so nothing ever had to change. And I hadn't told anyone that even now, even after all of it, part of me still wanted him to call and say something, anything, to prove he had heard me not just as a threat to his ego, but as his daughter. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then 2. No word from Frank. The Friday dinners stopped, not formally, but in that quiet way families fall apart when no one is willing to call and ask, "Are we still doing this?" Jessica sent a couple of polite texts about seeing the kids soon. I replied vaguely. Daniel didn't push. He had his own processing to do now, I could tell. Something in him had shifted, whether he wanted it to or not. And I didn't hate him for not reaching out more. I had spent enough years waiting for people to say the right thing at the right time. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life demanding it. One day, in early spring, I came home to find an envelope stuck between my front door and the frame, not mailed, just wedged there by hand. No return address. No name. Inside was a photo of our family from 1998, the year Daniel graduated high school. We were all standing on the front lawn, Frank's hand on Daniel's shoulder, my mother beside them with a smile so wide it looked forced, and me, on the end, half-turned, holding the family dog in my arms and looking somewhere just past the camera. Like I already knew this picture wasn't really about me. On the back, written in a shaky but unmistakable script, was a single line. I see it now. No signature. No apology. No explanation. Just that. And maybe that's all I'll ever get. Maybe that's all there is. I won't pretend it fixed anything. It didn't make up for the years I spent shrinking myself to fit a space I was never really allowed to occupy. It didn't undo the birthdays spent waiting for a compliment that never came or the slow erosion of self-worth carved out by 100 seemingly harmless comments. But it meant something. Not everything, but something. Some nights, when I think about it too long, I wonder if I was wrong, if there might have been another way to speak my truth without delivering it like a blade. If I could have softened the words, wrapped them in kindness, made them easier to digest. But then I remember how many years I did exactly that. How many times I swallowed what needed to be said and offered silence in its place, hoping someone would notice the weight I was carrying without me needing to name it. And I come back to this. Sometimes honesty isn't about healing. Sometimes it's not about reconciliation or understanding or even justice. Sometimes it's just about ending the story you were told to live and finally starting the one you choose for yourself. Not to win. Not to hurt. Just to be free. So, was I wrong? Maybe. But for the first time in my life, I'm not asking anyone else to tell me.